The turn of the 20th century marked America's entry into the modern age. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone was becoming a household staple, and people were now talking to each other all over the country. Thomas Edison's new recording machine was allowing popular trends in music to cross the oceans and influence others far afield. And in cities across the nation, the horse and wagon was steadily being replaced by the automobile. And while it was easy to see how the small, once isolated local practices in faith, economy, business, education, and the arts were having a broader influence across the world, what wasn't readily apparent was how these new world trends were affecting the small communities back at home. That helps to explain the birth of jazz. New Orleans had traditionally been a melting pot for cultures from around the globe. African slaves, German socialites, French aristocrats, Italian businessmen, Spanish traders, artisans and tradesmen from the Caribbean and South America, French Canadians, and the traditions of the Old South. All of these cultures began to pool their customs and their music. In the late 1800s, before radio and television and the internet, music was a preeminent form of entertainment, and New Orleans was the place where these musical traditions came together. At the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States Army and Navy bands were mustered out in New Orleans, which left a glut of musical instruments in pawn shops all over the city. This supply of inexpensive instruments, paired with a music-loving public, led to a lot of experimentation and discovery, as hundreds of would-be musicians began to learn to play these instruments and the music they loved by ear. Now, instead of passing down precise music through the European method of notation, these musicians developed something akin to the method of passing down an oral history. As they relied on their ears and their memory, the music began to change. Soon, the interpretation of each musician became a valued portion of the music. His improvisation became the order of the day. And with this interpretation and improvisation, a new music was born. Jazz. Crude at first, but gaining refinement at a lightning pace. As the musicians spread across the country, this new music spread with them. By 1925, jazz had captured the imagination of America, both black and white. Musicians were drawn to it because it required a commitment of creativity by the player like no other music. Non-musicians were drawn to it because it represented a new freedom of expression in society that threw off the yoke of an older generation and celebrated a new prosperity for young Americans. Young Louis Armstrong soon came to be known as the main proponent and inspiration for jazz music, and his influence in jazz and what would soon be known as pop continues to this day. Some call this early form of jazz Dixieland. Others use terms like traditional, vintage, or classic jazz. Whatever tag you like, it remains a unique form of expression for jazz musicians even today. It is played all over the world by hobbyists and professionals alike. In 1989, in Atlanta, Georgia, clarinetist and bandleader Don Erdman gathered some of the finest jazz musicians from around the country and formed a new jazz band that specializes in Dixieland jazz and swing, featuring music by some of America's greatest composers. The band found immediate success in Atlanta and soon was making tours throughout the world, including Europe, the Middle East, Japan, even Russia. They continue to perform this music at the highest level of musicianship and with an entertaining showmanship and stage presence. From King Oliver in 1928 to Don Erdman in 2008, here is the Hotlanta Dixieland Jazz Band.
Just what I need, I'll say that. When the world goes wrong and I got the blues, it's one that makes me get out of my He's got to find, you know, say he has. When the world goes wrong and I got the blues, he's the one that makes me get out, put my dancing shoes. The more I get, the more I want.